Hansa, Papastim Tsikaso. Today we're going to be doing some canning of our berries because we're sitting here, we're first week in September now, and over the summer we've been picking berries whenever we can because each of the berries that we pick, that we normally pick in the bush here in my area, they all ripen and they're ready at different times. So we usually pick throughout the summer as the berries are ready, and then what we'll usually do is we'll bag them and we'll just freeze them until it's time for us to do all of our canning. Now some people, they can them as soon as they pick them and try and can them fresh, but that's a lot to go through that process because it's a lot of work doing the canning of them. So we usually just put them in a freezer bag, and they're only frozen for a short time. We don't want to really store our berries frozen for too long. A month or something at the most is probably about the longest you want to freeze them, because anything after that, they start to lose their flavor, they get mushy, and they start to lose their nutritional value in them. And they might get freezer burned, and they don't taste very well. So a month at the most. But what we usually do is we pick throughout the summer months as the berries ripen and they're ready to be picked. We pick them, we bag them, freeze them until it's time for us to can them. Now the reason for canning is, of course, we're looking at finding ways to ensure food security. And by what I mean by ensuring food security is meaning that we have the food available to us when we need it. And not only that, it's always nice during the other months of the year, the other 10 months or 11 months of the year, when you're not able to eat these berries or anything we've harvested off the land. It's nice to have them in those cold winter months and be able to open up a can of berries or something and have them taste that fresh nutritional flavor out of having berries during the winter months. So of course traditionally with berries like Saskatoons especially were especially favored because they're abundant. They grow better than any other berries, and they're easier to pick than most of the other berries. So you can pick a lot in a short amount of time with the Saskatoons. Traditionally with the Saskatoons, because they didn't have the canning stuff and the jars and everything available to them, what they would do is they dry them. Now, when they dry them, sometimes they would just lay out the berries, just lay the berries out in the sun and let them dry, but they'd make sure they weren't touching each other, and they just let them dry like that. However, that often causes a problem too, because when they would lay them out to dry like this, a lot of the times the bigger berries would keep that moisture and they'd end up molding. So they wouldn't completely dry out and they'd end up molding, and they're not very good. So what they did to overcome that, and what my elders had taught me, is they would actually crush the Saskatoons. So they would, even just putting it on a flat rock or something and then just crushing them. And they flatten them until all the juice comes out of them. And making sure that they're completely crushed. Then what they would do is they would take those crushed berries and they would squeeze the juice out of them, and they would make them into almost little cookies. So they'd squeeze the juice out, all the juice possible they could squeeze out, and they'd make these cookies like this, as thin as they could. Then they'd lay them out in the sun like that to dry. Now these would dry really quick and there would be no moisture left in them. They would completely dry and they wouldn't get that mold forming on them. So they're very easy. They could store this like this after it's completely dried and have those Saskatoons available to them throughout the year. Because once they're completely dried, they lasted a really long time as Saskatoon patties. But they would, most of the time they'd make them maybe the size of a puck or something, but really thin. And they'd completely dry them in the sun until they're basically crunchy little Saskatoon cookies. But those would last for months and months and months when they needed them. So after first contact, and with the coming of different materials and such, of course we had the jars, and they proved to be a good way of storing the food, because when done properly, when you do store stuff like berries in a jar or can them, they can last for years. Some of them can, I've known some elders keeping them for up to 5 years and they're still, open the jar and they're still as fresh as the day they canned them, if done properly. But that really ensures that they have their berries available to them all the time, whenever they need them, and they could store them, easily store them, especially if they didn't, back in the days of my mom and my kokum and my tapans, they didn't have, most of the time they didn't have a reliable refrigerator or anything like that, so they would do the canning as a way of preserving and keeping that food to ensure food security for when they needed it. And they would can a lot, just like I still do today. Gather, pick the berries all summer. When we get towards fall time, that's when I do all the canning and then have all of those berries and everything that I picked throughout the summer ready to store for whenever I need them, or for whenever I feel like having a can of fresh berries. This way is preferred amongst elders because we know what's going into our jars. We know exactly where, right from when we picked it out in the bush, right to when we put it and seal it in that jar. We know what's gone into there. There's no preservatives, there's no additives, there's no chemicals, nothing. It's just all natural. So we're not unsure of what's in there. So we know exactly what we're putting in our bodies, and we know every part of this process is going to produce something healthy for us. So when we're canning in preparation, of course, we need different things. We need our pots for putting our berries in. We need canning pots, large pots, and of course we need our canning jars. Now with canning jars, they're specially made. They're not just any jar. You could buy them in most hardware stores, but each jar is a glass jar, and it's got the sealing ring and the sealer lid. So these are the rings, these are the sealer lids. With the sealing lids, you'll see here they've got this rubber ring around them. That's actually what completely seals off the jar to make sure no bacteria or anything gets in, or any mold or anything gets into the jar. And that's what actually causes a tight seal. Because what we're going to actually do when we start the canning is we heat the jar, make sure the jar is heated, and we make sure the sealer lid is heated. And once we put them together, they sort of form around each other, and because this rubber sealer softens up and it forms a complete seal around that lid, closing everything in, and then we put our ring on and we just tighten it down. and then we go through another process, but I'll be showing you the full process. The other things we need, of course, is some kind of scoop for when our berries are finished and ready to can. We can scoop them out. Maybe a ladle for scooping out the berries to put into the can. And one of these jar poppers I like to use because it's nice and wide here and it's not going to cause me to spill anything around the jar or on the jar lid. Because remember, this has to be completely clean when I put those seals together. If I just pour it in, I'm going to spill juice all around this lid and it's going to ruin my seal. And I'm not going to get a good seal on there. It'll spoil all of my hard work. So I like to use one of these with a wide lid, enough so that when I'm scooping my berries, just pour it in there. So nothing's going to get around the rim of the jar. And it's going to keep it nice and clean, so there's not a bunch of splashing going on all over. Of course, again, all of our jar rings and all of our jar seals, sealing cover, and I'm going to show you what we're going to do with those. But the first thing I've got to do is here I've got all of the blueberries that we've picked. I've put them in water, but you'll see I've just put it so the berries are just covered, able to submerge, and they're not really, there's not a whole lot of water, like it's not swimming in water, just enough so that they get submerged in water. And there's actually they're kind of tight in there, which is fine. I just want to make sure they're covered by water. In this pot here, I've got strawberries and rhubarb together. Strawberries and rhubarb is a nice, elders really love that combination with the strawberries and rhubarb because rhubarb by itself is very bitter. You'd have to put a lot of sugar to make it have a good flavor. But the rhubarb with the strawberry adds a really nice flavor. And they mix well together. It gives it a really nice flavor. So with those two, you'll see I've just put enough water so they're not swimming in the water, but they're enough to submerge them in the water. Now with most of our berries, some elders like it just like this because most of the berries, like a blueberry, will have a natural sweetness to it. But with strawberry and rhubarb, if we cook it like this, we're still going to taste that bitterness from the rhubarb and very little of that sweet. But we want to make it so it's not quite a jam, but so that we add sugar enough to keep, it'll penetrate within everything and make it sort of like a syrup. So when we do decide to eat these or use them later, the water and everything tastes really good because you got that syrup. So we would add sugar. So with this strawberry rhubarb, I've got just over halfway filled with strawberry rhubarb and water. So I'm going to put about 1.5 cups of sugar just to add that sweetness and make it kind of a syrup. Little bigger pot here with the blueberries. And the blueberries have their own natural sweetness too. So I'm also going to put about 1.5 cups of sugar into there too, just so I get that sugar, syrup consistency when I do boil them. So I'm going to put these on the stove, and I'm going to get them so they're bring them up to a boil, and then I'm going to let them just simmer at a slow rolling boil until all of the juices from the berry mixes with the sugar and creates a syrup in there. So I just mix my sugar in. And I don't have to really worry about mixing it too much because once it starts boiling, that sugar is going to really penetrate and get all over, but it's going to create that syrup, thicker syrup consistency and give a really good flavor. So Saskatoons, I'll do exactly the same once the blueberries and the strawberry rhubarb is done. I'll put the Saskatoons in the pot just like that, and I'll add my probably about the same cup and a half of sugar, or maybe even a cup if you don't like things too sweet. And then I'm going to bring them to a slow boil. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to put these on the stove, and it's going to take maybe about 30 minutes, probably about 15 minutes to get them up to a boil, and then I want to let them slow rolling boil for another 15 minutes. So about 30 minutes, I'm going to put these on the stove. We'll let them do their thing on the stove, and once that's finished, we'll go on and I'll show you the next step to canning our berries. Alright, so we're on to step 2 of our canning our berries. And what I did while we've got our berries, they've boiled, and you can see, especially with the strawberries, you can see that for the most part the rhubarb has fallen apart, and it kind of made this really built a good syrup in there with the sugar added. And now we're ready to can this with the strawberry rhubarb, as well with the blueberries here. You can see they've boiled as well. Blueberries won't fall apart like the strawberries and rhubarb do. They'll mostly stay whole. But we've got that nice syrup from the boiling with the sugar and the water and the juices of the berries. So now we're ready to start canning. But before I can start canning, what I did with these jars is, you can see in this pot here, the jars were heated, boiled, brought to a boil. 2 reasons for heating up your jars, and we'll get going here quickly before these jars cool off, because I did the same thing with these jars. You want to heat your jars, get them to a boil, and once after they're done boiling, you want to make sure you absolutely don't touch any of the rings, because we want to create a perfect seal, and we don't want anything to obstruct or ruin that seal. So the oils on our fingers will ruin a seal, so we don't touch the seals at all. And the other reason for boiling and heating the jars is that the berries are super hot right now, and once we pour them in there, if we don't heat our jars and they're not hot jars, it's going to shock the glass, and the jar is just going to burst, because hot and cold don't like each other. So hot berries, cold jar, absolutely don't get along. If we pour it in a cold jar, the jar is just going to explode because we shock the glass. So we want to be careful to bring these up to heat and get them nice and hot. The other reason is not just to bring it up to the close to the temperature of the berries. The other reason is to sterilize everything and to kill any germs or bacteria that may have been on the jars, and to make sure nothing is going to ruin our preserving the berries. Because if any germs or anything, bacteria get in there, it's going to ruin that preserving effect of sealing them in the jars. So we want to heat them, sterilize them, get them nice and hot, and then we can put our hot berries in. So again, before I said I like to use this because it's going to keep my the rims from being touched by anything. I'm not going to spill any berry juice on there, and it's going to keep it nice and clean. The other thing I've done is I boiled my sealing lids, because I want to get them nice and hot so that the rubber seal on there gets really soft, and it'll completely form around the jar lid when I put it on there, and it'll instantly create a seal as soon as I put it on there. And then the rings, it doesn't really matter because they're steel rings, brass rings, some of them, but it doesn't really matter with the rings. But absolutely the lids, you want to heat them up so that the rubber seal get soft enough to form a complete seal here. So, as soon as I put the berries in the jar, I'm gonna move right on to the next step. And with the next step, what I do is I put the jars in my pot, because I'm gonna want to bring these up to a boil, get them boiling, get everything nice and hot, because again, that's gonna create my seal. It's gonna let all of the gases release, any gases that might remain in there or any possible contaminants. It's gonna release those through the lid, and then once I cool it, everything is going to completely seal, and it's going to kind of pull in. And we'll see that process when it does happen a little later. But we'll see how everything creates a vacuum. A complete, sealed, absolutely sterilized vacuum. That's what's going to keep these berries preserved for months and months, and maybe even years and years if we seal it right. Now, when I do put the jars to boil, very important, I don't put the jars directly on the steel of the pot, because we do not want glass jars facing direct heat from anything. So we've got to pull them away from the direct heat of the stove. So with something like this canner here, and you can see my other jars are still heating in here, so they stay hot. With this canner, it comes with this plate that sort of creates a separation between, so the jars are absolutely not touching the direct heat of the burner on the stove. If you don't have that, fine. What we always used to do was just make it like this and put some of our old lids, our old jar rings, put them on the bottom, but what it does is it pulls those jars away from the direct heat, because if you get that glass being heated on the direct heat of a stove element, it's going to shatter the jar, because that heat is way too intense. So we pull it away from the heat of the element. So I'm going to start filling these. Once I've filled them, I'm going to put them in my pot, and then we'll show you the next step from there. So while I'm doing this, again, some items I want to have. One of these, so when I'm grabbing these hot lids, because they just came off the boil, so they're hot. I don't want to just stick my fingers in there. Again, my ladle for scooping the berries out of there. And because everything's going to be hot, I've got one of these jar tools here, and it just picks up the jar without me having to touch them. If you don't have one of these, oven mitts for sure, because remember, everything is really hot. And again, we want to keep it hot, because that's what's sterilizing everything. So I'll begin by filling one of my jars. Put my cover on, and this is the strawberry rhubarb. I'm going to start pouring that in. And for the most part, I want to be grabbing as much of the solids as I can first. And I'll just pour those in there. Careful not to be splashing, because these are hot right now. So I want to take it just to the very rim of the jar here, so just the very bottom. Most people say like an inch of, they call it head space. So you want some space in there for those gases, and for anything that, like if anything at all hasn't completely cooked or heated, it's going to expand a little. So you want a little bit of room left in there. Otherwise, if you fill it right to the top, if anything, any of the gases or anything expands, it's going to pour out of the jar. It's going to ruin the seal. It's going to ruin your final product, and it's just going to create a big mess. So you want to leave that little bit of space. So I'll take this one up to about where we want it. Careful that I'm not going to drip anything on the sides. Put it to the next jar. But you see here, it's very hot, but you can see how much space I've left between there. So I'm going to go ahead and finish filling these ones, and then we'll move to the next step. As I fill them, I'll just pull them out of the way. But with With these, as soon as I've got the lid on, it's always good to grab your sealing lid, place it on there, and then take one of your rings. Again, this is really hot, so I'm going to put a glove on so I can hold the jar. But I'm just going to put the lid on. And we just want to finger tighten these. We don't want to over tighten them, because if you over tighten it, once it starts heating up, when we put it to the final process, those gases are going to start to come out and it's going to explode. So we just finger tighten it so it leaves a little bit of room where that gas can escape. So by finger tightening, I usually just use 3 fingers, and I'm not putting any pressure. I'm just turning it with my fingers until my fingers slip. So very lightly. And that's enough. I'm not going to, so see, it's off again. I take it till I can feel it snug. Take my fingers, very lightly touching it with my 3 fingers, and you see my fingers slipping across the lid. That's finger tight. I don't want to tighten it absolutely anymore, because I want to leave a little bit of space there for if gases need to escape, they'll just escape out the top. After I've done that, I pick it up and I set it in place, ready in my pot, and then I'll fill up that whole pot with the jars with the strawberry and rhubarb. So I'll continue doing that, and as soon as I do that, I'll show you the next step. Alright, so we've filled all of our jars, and we put the jars back into the pot. And what I did, remember, the jars are still hot, the berries are still hot, but we've still got one more process to go through. So I put them into the pot here, and you'll see inside the pot that I've just filled. Once I put the jars in the pot, again, I had that ring in the bottom to make sure the jars aren't going on directly on the heat. So it lifts them up a bit. But I put them in here, and then I put water in here, and you'll see I didn't completely submerge them in water. I put them in just enough water just below the brass ring. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to get these up to a boil, and that's going to finish that's not only the sealing process, but the process of killing any germs or any bacteria that might have gotten on any of the rings or any of the jars while we're doing this process. So I'm going to bring it up to a boil, and then I'm going to let it boil for about 15 minutes at a rolling boil. And that's going to bring it up to probably about 100 degrees, 115 degrees, maybe max, but probably closer to 100 and 105 degrees Celsius. And it's going to almost get those berries boiling inside that jar again to kill any last bacteria or germs that might be in there. And that's why I said when we put the lids, we put them finger tight, because any gases escaping once it starts to boil, it needs to be able to push up just slightly on that rubber seal that's there for that gas to get out, but none of the fluid to get out. That's why we leave that little bit of space. That's going to give us that space where if it does expand, it's not going to spill out over and overflow and then ruin the seal. It's going to give it that room to expand when it's boiling, and then it's going to settle, and that's when it does settle, when it starts to cool. That's what creates the vacuum, and it builds a complete seal, kills the bacteria, kills any germs, builds a vacuum seal, because we know that when anything heats up, it expands, and when anything cools down, it contracts or it goes smaller. So that's the process we want to happen in these jars. It's going to expand, let out any gases, and then once it starts to cool, that seal is going to stay sealed, and it's going to cool and contract or get smaller, and it's going to create that vacuum in there that's free of germs or bacteria, but it's going to seal in everything completely. So we're going to go ahead and put this on the stove, bring it to a complete boil, then we're going to let it boil for about 15 minutes at a rolling boil, and then we'll show you the next process once that's done. Alright, so we're going through our final process on canning our berries. And what we've just finished doing is we put our jars into the water, we let it come up to a boil, and then we've left it boiling for about 15, maybe 20 minutes until the temperature inside the jars gets to the same boiling temperature outside. So we're almost making those berries boil again inside the jar. And that's just so we could create that vacuum in there, as well as getting it hot enough to kill all of the bacteria, all of the germs, so that it's completely sealed and there's no chance of it spoiling on us, and we'll get that perfect vacuum. So now that we've got them hot, we'll take them out, and you'll see I've got rubber gloves on, oven mitts on, because everything is super hot here. They just came out of the boil. Now when I take a jar out, what I like to do is, and that's why I'm wearing the oven mitts, is I give it a quick little tighten just to complete that seal, and so I don't forget later to tighten them. Now it's already creating a seal, but what's going to happen is with the lids, you'll notice when we get them new, they're actually out a little. So they're concave. And this one is not as good as some of the others. But you'll notice it's kind of concave. That means it's kind of going out, arching out. So with these lids, since they're concave, what's going to happen is when that seal is created, it's going to go convex, and that means it's going to go inwards and suck inwards and create that vacuum seal for us, so that these are going to be vacuum sealed, and it's going to be totally sterile in there and vacuum sealed, so it's going to keep for a really long time. So right now it's bowed out, which is convex, and then we want it to go concave where it bows in. So once they cool, as they cool, we're going to hear a pop. And you already hear some of the jars popping. But that's that vacuum being created as everything starts to cool. Remember I had told you in the last video that when it starts to boil, everything expands, so it kind of pushes out and any gases kind of escape here. Now that it's cooling, everything is starting to contract and go inwards. So as it does that, it's pulling in the air, it's pulling in that vacuum seal, and it's completing the seal, and it'll pop in, and you can hear some of them popping, and it'll pull that vacuum in. So we want all of them. That's how you know that you've got a good seal, is once you look at them from the very top, and you can see if that top has pulled in to creating that vacuum. So we'll just continue. I'm just going to pull them all out before I tighten them. So remember, everything's super hot. We've got to be very careful. We don't want to put them too close together because we want them to cool. And if we put them too close together, they're going to keep giving each other and feeding each other heat. So we want them to cool. That's what's going to create that vacuum for us and seal them. And you'll notice I've got the towel on here just so I'm not burning my countertop. So after I've got them all out again, I'm going to go ahead and give them a quick tighten with my oven mitts on, just to complete that seal until they're all tightened. Because remember, when we put them in, we put them finger tight. So now we want to fully tighten them, because now it's creating that vacuum. So like I said, as they cool, we're going to hear them pop, and that cover is going to go pull inwards and go concave. And that's what we want. That's going to create our vacuum, create our seal. The last thing I'd always do is my labels. So we want to know what's in here. We want to know when it was canned. So it usually just go by the month. So you'll see here with these, I've got strawberry rhubarb, September 2024. So once they're cooled, I'm going to wait till they cool. If I put it on now, then this label is just going to peel off because the glue will melt. But I'm going to let them cool, then I'm going to label them. Again, what's in there, month, and the year it was canned, so that I can get a good idea of how long I should keep them, because if after maybe 4 or 5 years or something, they probably be sealed, but you don't really want to take a chance, because as they're cooling and warming and changing temperature, it's going to affect that seal in there over time, and eventually that seal will break that vacuum. So you want to keep an eye that you know how long it's been there. After they've cooled, I'm going to put them in a cool, dark place, a dry place where it's not going to get any moisture. Any moisture at all is going to form mold and bad stuff on the outside of the jar. So even though the contents inside might be good, there might be contaminants outside. So when we do open it, there's a chance that mold and stuff might go inside. So we want a cool, dry, dark place to store them. Somewhere where the temperature is not going to change a whole lot, because you don't want that temperature changing from hot to cold where these are stored. Otherwise, again, like I said, it's going to affect that seal, and it's probably going to end up breaking that vacuum, and it'll end up spoiling. So now they're cooling, and you can hear those lids popping now. So once they've all finished popping and they've cooled so that I can touch them, I'm going to store them in a cool, dark, dry cupboard, and they'll be good for years to come. That's how we can our berries and ensure our food security throughout the winter months.